Hi folks, Smudge here and welcome to Mastering in the Box, your home for simple guidance on digital mastering and digital audio. In today's video I'm going to show you how you can use the stock limiter inside of Studio One 5 to get great sounding masters. I'm even going to show you how to use the limiters in a stacked limiting format. So without further ado, let's get into it. So here we are inside of Studio One, and the song we're going to feature for this week's video is the song Billy by Nik Graveswell. So let's take a brief listen. So it's a great sounding track, lots of energy, some nice dynamics in there, and this was a track that I mastered a couple of years ago. So links in the description down below. If you want to take a listen on your favourite streaming platform of choice, there'll be some links down below. So one of the most frequent questions I still get asked is how do you get your track sounding louder without really damaging the dynamics of the track and making the track sound squashed, or without having a load of artifacts and distortion? And one of the best ways, or the most popular ways that I would certainly recommend, is to stack limiters. Now, stacking limiters is a concept that I've discussed before. It's nothing new, but one of the things about limiting is sometimes you can overstress a limiter. So for example, if you leave too much headroom and you start putting a load of gain into the limiter, you can find very soon that you will start to either squash the track, or you'll start to get a lot of artifacts and distortion, which just makes the overall track sound nasty. So actually, by sharing the load between two limiters or a clipper and a limiter, you can get a better sounding end result. And that's basically what I'm going to show you today. Now, first and foremost, the stock limiter inside of Studio One 5, it's the limiter 2, but it's just a couple of tweaks that I just want to quickly point out. By default, the threshold here is set to -3 dBs. I always set the limiter here to 0. With the threshold of the limiter, you're effectively going to lower the threshold, which is going to it's just going to add more compression. So as the threshold comes down and the peak goes above the threshold, then anything above the threshold will start to be compressed. And we don't want that from a limiter. The way that I like to use a limiter is by setting the ceiling and using almost the ceiling as the threshold, rather than having an additional threshold, because you're just going to add compression on top of compression. So I'd always recommend here, leave the threshold down at 0. And in the ceiling, if you're only going to use your limiter for mastering purposes, then set the ceiling to -1 dB. Especially if you're just starting out mastering or you're relatively new to mastering, set the ceiling to -1. The reason why we're doing this is for the streaming platforms. So the streaming platforms will recommend that we leave 1 dB's worth of headroom, so have a true peak value of no more than -1 dB. And this just allows a little bit of headroom. If there's any additional gain added as part of the upload process, then you know you won't have a clipped song at the end of it. So set the ceiling at -1, and if you go here in the middle of the plugin, you'll see this little box which stores all the presets, and you've got this option here to store as default preset. So just click that, and that will mean that your limiter, every time you add a limiter, it will default with a ceiling at -1 and a threshold of 0. So we're going to set this up. I'm going to start with limiter number 2 first. So this is going to very much act like a true peak style limiter, a brick wall limiter. So this is going to be last in the chain to ensure we get no digital clipping. And as you can see on here, we've got a true peak value or a soft clip value. And for this particular instance, I want to use true peak. So this is going to measure in true peak format. So it's going to take into consideration any intersample peaks and the recreation of the waveform from the digital to analog conversion and vice versa. And this is very much going to be our brick wall. And what I want to do is I'm going to start by increasing the gain. I'm going to go to around 2 dBs and I'm going to boost it up to around 5. And you'll start to hear the track really start to compress. So let's take a listen. So it's one of the challenges when we're using a limiter is sometimes it's just so easy to kind of apply too much gain and you start to make the track sound really, really squashed. And we can sit here and we could play with the attack and release and we can go for a slightly faster attack, but it depends on really how you want to set it. If you start going down that route, you've really got to kind of hone in. But there is an alternative, and that's to use either another limiter in conjunction with your brick wall or to use a clipper. And what I've got here again is another version of the limiter 2. I've actually set this one to soft clip mode. So the difference between the true peak and the soft clip, the true peak is effectively going to compress anything over and above the ceiling, whereas the soft clip is effectively going to clip the top of the waveform. So it's not going to start adding a lot of, nastiness and digital artifacts, and it's also not going to sound squashed, and you're not going to get that unwanted ducking. But it's going to allow you to boost a little bit more gain into the signal without really starting to, impact on the track with the dynamics and the energy. So let's try this again now, and what I'm going to do is boost the gain a little bit, probably another couple of dBs on limiter 1, and let's take another listen.
Daddy got mad. Billy tried to fight him with all that he had. Billy got the gun from under the stairs, pointed it at Daddy, pulled the trigger for tears.
So just by doing that with the first limiter going into the second limiter and using the first limiter in soft clip mode, it's enabled us to get that extra 1.98 dB, so a couple of dBs extra volume overall, without really starting to squash and overstress the second limiter. Now, one of the great things about this as well is with the first limiter, we've got a couple of different options. We could now set the ceiling on the first limiter slightly lower, because don't forget, with the second limiter, with that acting as our brick wall, as long as we set a ceiling which ensures that the first limiter doesn't clip, we can actually reduce this down to around 0.3 dBs, which is going to take a little bit of extra compression or extra bit of clipping off of the first limiter. Let's take another listen.
Mama spilled the beer and Daddy got mad. Billy tried to fight him with all that he had. Billy.
So instantly we've got a much better result than when we was putting 4 or 5 dBs into just one single limiter alone. Now we can kind of work with this a little bit differently. So if we thought the second limiter is getting gain reduction of around 3.3 dBs. So let's bring this one back to say 1.2, and let's boost this one a little bit more to say 3. And let's take another listen now.
Mama spilled the beer and Daddy got mad. Billy tried to fight him with all that he had. Billy.
So what we can see here is the gain reduction on both of the limiters. Whilst this one's increased slightly, this one's actually reduced quite significantly. So it's once again, it's another way of just going through limiting and really getting the sound that you want. And if you find that you're starting to push too much gain into your limiter, then why don't you just have a play around, put another limiter in conjunction with it. You don't have to put this one in soft clip mode. So let's try this now in true peak mode. And let's have now 2 true peak limiters, one with a slightly reduced ceiling, and the final one with the signal -1. Let's take a listen and see how this sounds now.
Mama spilled the beer and Daddy got mad. Billy tried to fight him with all that he had. Billy got the.
So we've now got a couple of options where we can start to increase the overall level of the track without really starting to squash it, without introducing a lot of digital nastiness and artifacts. So I think this is a really great tool. So if you're looking at trying to get your track sounding louder using a limiter in the mastering stage, then rather than using a single limiter, try stacking the limiters. Use the first limiter in soft clip mode and use the second one in true peak mode and see how you get on with these results. So that's it for this week's video, and I hope you found this useful. It's still one of the most common questions I get asked about mastering and limiting and how to use a limiter and how you can get your track sounding louder without really squashing the track. And hopefully this has given you a few different ideas on how you can use the stop limiter inside of Studio One or any stop limiter. Most of the popular DAWs, they all have stop limiters and many will feature a limiter, and you can use these in different ways to get different results. And it's great to have the versatility of the soft clip mode as well as the true peak mode. So if you want to get a slightly more subtle limiting or clipping going into your final limiter, you can do that natively inside of Studio One 5. So it's a really great tool. Experiment with it, try the soft clip, try the true peak, and experiment with some of the attack and release settings. We haven't covered this in today's video, but it will be something I'll be covering at some point in the very near future. But if you want to get a more natural sound, try and experiment with a faster attack and a slower release, because then you're not going to start getting that continuing opening of the limiter. You'll get a much more natural, broader limiting going through your mastering session. So once again, I hope you found this useful. If you want to know more about digital mastering, then make sure you hit that subscribe button below and make sure you tick that bell and select all to receive notifications on all of our videos moving forward. And if you're interested in hiring me as a mastering engineer, there'll be some links in the description, as well as details of my mixing and mastering critique service through fiverr.com. So all that's left for me to say is I hope you'll keep safe and well, and I'll see you in the next video coming real soon.